in a lonely desert land on the border of Kansas and Oklahoma, where the law was as thin as the red dust blowing in the wind. A giant woman was hung upside down under the burning sun. Her body was covered in blood, her eyes were still clear, and the only words she spoke were just, "Kill me already." Those words were not a cry for pity, but a sign of a hidden story, full of injustice and hate. When an old cowboy, once a soldier in the Civil War, happened to ride past and chose not to turn away, he did not know he had just pulled the trigger on a chain of events. That choice would push them both into a fight for survival, where justice had to be dug up from blood, and the truth could only live if someone was brave enough to protect it. Now, today I will tell you that story. The desert wind blew hard across the barren land, carrying the smell of burned sun and red dust. Beside a rough wooden frame, a huge body swayed in silence. It was a woman, almost 2 meters tall, hanging upside down by a coarse rope from a dead tree branch. She was nearly unconscious, but her eyes were still half open. On her sun-burned skin were deep bruises, whip marks, and lines of dried blood, like proof of deep hatred. Eli Morgan, an old cowboy with gray hair and eyes that had seen war, was riding back to his riverside camp when he stopped. The sight in front of him froze him in the road. He had seen many people die. In battle, he had left friends behind, and in towns full of injustice, he had learned how to turn away. But this time, something held him there. Eli got off his horse and walked closer. The woman slowly opened her eyes and whispered, not asking for help, but saying each word with effort, "Just kill me already." Her voice held no fear, only emptiness. She did not believe anyone had come to save her, and Eli knew that was exactly why he could not walk away. He pulled out his knife and cut the rope. Her heavy body fell, and he quickly caught her. His arms tightened to hold her weight, but his eyes stayed on her dusty, wounded face. There was something about her, not just her unusual size, but a fierce gibberness. Someone had tortured her, yet she was still alive. And if she was still alive, then maybe there was something that still needed to be told. Eli carried her to his small shack near the Arkansas River, where he lived day to day like a ghost after the war. He laid her on the old wooden bed and began to clean her wounds. For a full day and night, she said nothing, only breathing heavily, her eyes opening and closing. It was not until the second morning that she spoke again. "My name is Grace. Grace Whitetail." Her voice was weak but clear. Eli only nodded. He did not ask questions, did not force her to talk. But when he turned and stepped outside, questions echoed in his mind, questions he was afraid to answer. Who would do this to someone like her? And why? From that moment on, the fate of Eli and Grace became tied together, in a way neither of them could have ever expected. And from that sentence, "My name is Grace, Grace Whitetail," everything began to change. After many hours of silence, the sound of her full name was like a key that opened the first door between two strangers. Over the next few days, as her wounds were wrapped and her strength slowly returned, Grace began to speak more, not because she trusted him, but because she was tired, like someone who had nothing left to lose. One rainy evening, Eli sat by the fire, while Grace lay facing the wooden wall. Suddenly, she spoke. Her voice was low and steady, as if she were telling a dream she had lived through hundreds of times. "My father was a blacksmith. His name was Isaac Whitetail. He was not rich, but he worked hard and lived in a small wooden house on the edge of Cold Ridge. The white people in town did not like him, but they needed him, because no one else could shape steel like he could. Until one day," she stopped and took a deep breath. Eli did not ask anything. He quietly added more wood to the fire. "People started to say my father had found gold. A hunter claimed he saw my father buy cornmeal using real gold coins. After that, they began watching our house. I did not believe it. My father never spoke about gold. Then one night, I was in the woods hunting rabbits, and my father was at home. When I returned, the door was wide open. The forge was still burning, but my father was gone." Her voice began to shake slightly. I searched everywhere and called his name, but I only found a trail of blood leading behind the horse stable. They killed him. I know it. But they said he ran away after stealing gold from the town store. And I, because I was his daughter, was blamed as his partner. Grace turned her head and looked at Eli. Her eyes were not wet with tears, only cold, like a winter river. They hung me like an animal. No trial, no law, just punishment. Because I was the child of someone who did not belong there. Because I was different. Eli nodded slowly. Inside him, something shifted, like a stone moving in a mind that had been asleep for years. He once believed in order. He once wore a uniform. He once used the law against troublemakers. But this story was not like anything he had known. There was no arrest order, sir, no proof. Only rumors and a rope. He looked at Grace. In her eyes, there was no fear left, only pain held deep inside. And at that moment, Eli understood something clearly. If he turned away from this truth, he would never be a real human being again. At that moment, Eli understood one thing clearly. He was standing in front of a truth that, if he turned away from it, he would never be a real human being again. That night, after the rain had stopped and cold wind slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls, Eli sat by the fire, holding a cup of thick black coffee. Grace lay silent on the bed, but her eyes were still open. Those eyes seemed to look straight through the rough wooden wall, into distant memories that both of them were trying to bury. "Do you know," Eli said at last, his voice low and steady, "I used to be a jail guard." Grace slowly turned her head, but did not answer. "I used to believe the law was the only thing that kept people from becoming animals, that there was right and wrong, order. But then I saw a man, a poor man, hanged for a murder he never committed. I was on duty that night, right before he died. He looked at me and said, 'I don't need you to save me. I need you to remember that this happened.'" Eli set the coffee cup down and looked at Grace. "I remembered, and then I forgot. Until I met you." Silence stretched between them. Grace watched him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "So what are you going to do with me now? Take me back to town, or leave me here and wait for them to come find me?" Eli did not answer right away. He stood up, stepped outside, and stared across the dry, empty land. The moon hung dim in the sky. Years of wandering had taught him one thing. In this land, justice was not given. It had to be taken. He turned back, his voice firm. "I'm not handing you over to anyone, but I also don't know what I'm supposed to do." Grace narrowed her eyes, half doubtful, half exhausted. "You think you saved me because of your conscience, or because you felt sorry for me?" Eli shook his head. "Because I couldn't do nothing. Because you don't deserve to be hung up like a warning sign for something they call order." Grace slowly closed her eyes. A single drop slid quietly down her cheek. It was not the tear of weakness, but of someone who, for the first time, felt seen as a human being. "Do you think they'll let this go?" Eli asked, almost as if he was speaking to himself. Grace answered without opening her eyes. "No. They'll come back. And this time, not just for me." The words sounded like a warning, but instead of fear, they created a strange calm between them. The kind of silence that only exists between people who know they are standing at the edge of something dangerous. Eli sat down again and pulled an old pack of cigarettes from his coat. He lit one and took a long drag. Through the thin smoke, he said, "You don't need my pity, but maybe we can survive together." Grace opened her eyes and looked straight at him. "I don't need a hero," she said. "Good," Eli replied, a faint edge of dry humor in his eyes. Not to joke, but to make one thing clear. He was just a man, trying to do the right thing in a world that was wrong. Between broken lives, they did not need saving. They needed a choice. And that night, without saying it out loud, they both chose the same thing: not to step back, not to run, not to hand their lives over to people hiding behind the law. The fight had not begun yet, but their hearts were already ready for what was coming. The fight had not started yet, but their hearts were already ready for what was coming. The next morning, the Kansas sky was dark and heavy, like a storm slowly moving closer. Eli stacked the half-burned boards from his old shack while thinking about the next step. He knew he could not hide Grace forever, not because he doubted her, but because he understood the people of Cold Ridge. They did not forget, and they did not forgive anyone who broke the silence they called order. Rumors that Grace was still alive spread faster than fire on dry grass. Some said she was a witch. Others claimed she carried a curse. But most people believed one simple thing: a monster like her still breathing was an insult to their power. 3 days later, a group of riders appeared on the narrow path leading to the forest edge. At the front was Sheriff Clay Hargrove, a man who had once served beside Eli in the army. Clay was different now. He was heavier, his belly round, his smile false, and his eyes sharp like a fox wearing a silver badge. Eli stood waiting by an old tree, his hand resting on his gun but not drawing it. Clay stayed on his horse. He leaned forward and spoke through his cigarette. "Eli, I hear you're keeping a big problem in that little house of yours." Eli said nothing. Sad to see it. A man who once served order, now hiding a wanted criminal. But I'll be clear. Hand her over, and this ends. If not— Clay paused and glanced at the men behind him. Big men. Cold eyes. Guns ready at their sides. Eli answered with one sentence. "I don't work for devils wearing silver badges." Clay smiled, but his eyes did not. "Fine," he said, turning his horse, then added one last cold warning. "Nice house you've got. Shame if it suddenly caught fire." That afternoon, flames rose from the shack. Eli and Grace were not there. They had left hours earlier, not out of fear, but because they knew time had stopped waiting for them. From his horse, Eli looked back once at the black smoke twisting up from what had been their shelter. He did not sigh. He did not get angry. He was quiet, as if he had expected this all along. Grace, sitting behind him, spoke softly. "I'm sorry." Eli shook his head. "You didn't burn it." "But I brought the fire," she whispered. "No," he said. They already had the oil. They did not speak again. They rode through the night, avoiding main roads, following the river and narrow paths few people used. Their destination was Fort Riley, a military post 2 days away, where Eli believed there were still a few people who understood real law. As the moon rose high, Eli looked up at the sky. There was no room left for doubt. He had chosen a side. Not Grace's side, but the side of justice. No matter how small or fragile it was, behind them lay ashes. Ahead was a hard road, but this time, they were not riding to escape. They were riding to face what was coming. Behind them were ashes. Ahead was a hard and dangerous road, but at least this time, they were not moving to run away. They were moving to face what waited for them. The road to Fort Riley was not covered with green grass or warm sunlight. It wore them down hour by hour with hunger, thirst, and the fear of being hunted. Eli chose paths that cut through pine forests and low valleys, far from any main road. The summer air was dry. Sweat soaked their clothes, and red dust stuck to their skin. They rode almost non-stop for 2 days, stopping only to eat a little or let the horses rest. Grace spoke very little. Even though she had healed a bit, the wounds on her back were still not fully closed. Every time the horse jumped over holes or rocky slopes, she clenched her teeth and endured the pain without a sound. Eli noticed, but he said nothing. He knew that sometimes the only thing a person needs is quiet company. On the 3rd day, the wind changed. A dust storm was coming. They stopped under a group of low oak trees, tied the horses, and rested. Eli shared the remaining water. There was less than one bottle left. Grace took it, drank a few sips, then handed it back. "I'm not as thirsty as you," she said. Eli smiled lightly. "Don't let kindness kill you. You need strength more than I do." At that moment, they did not know that 3 bounty hunters had been following their trail for half a day. They were not from Cold Ridge. They were outsiders. They cared only about money, not reasons. Clay had hired them, and a reward for the so-called monster had been posted in bars across the area. They moved fast and quiet. When Eli noticed, it was already too late. A shout rang out. "Drop your gun! Hands on your head!" Eli turned, his hand touching his gun, but a shot hit the ground near his foot. The leader, a man with a pitted face and thick beard, stepped forward with a cruel smile. "Didn't think an old man like you had the nerve to protect something like this." Grace stood up, her eyes cold as steel. "What do you want?" "We want you. And the money tied to that big head of yours." Eli spoke. "She's not a criminal." The man shrugged. "Sir, I don't care. Gold is gold." Before anyone could react, one of them rushed at Grace. He did not expect her body, even weak, to still be solid muscle. Grace knocked his arm away, sending him stumbling backward. The leader raised his gun. Eli jumped forward and took the bullet in his shoulder. The gunshot echoed. Birds scattered into the sky. Grace screamed and charged like a storm, knocking the shooter down and smashing her fist into his face. The last man pulled a knife and rushed her. Grace turned just in time, but the blade cut a long line from her shoulder down her side. Blood poured out, staining her shirt dark red. Instead of falling, she roared, grabbed his wrist, spun, and slammed him into a tree. In the end, all 3 men were on the ground. 1 dead, 2 unconscious. Eli lay nearby, holding his wounded shoulder. Blood soaked his sleeve, but he was still awake. Grace, shaking and bleeding, dropped down beside him. "You're crazy," she whispered. Eli smiled through heavy breaths. "So are you." They looked at each other, hurt but alive. Without words, they understood. What had just happened was not only about surviving. They had crossed a line. The line between 2 strangers, and 2 people who now lived together through fire. That night, they made a small camp near a stream. Grace wrapped Eli's wound. Her hands shook, but her eyes were sharp like a blade. "In pain?" Eli asked quietly. "Have you ever killed anyone before?" Grace did not answer right away. After a moment, she spoke slowly. "No, yeah, but today I killed to save you." Eli nodded and did not ask more. They both knew. From now on, they carried each other, in body and in spirit. And more, the road to Fort Riley was no longer a search for shelter, but a race against fate. A race where losing did not only mean death, but losing the chance to tell the truth. The night wind passed through, carrying the faint smell of blood and the distant call of an owl. In the thick darkness, Grace sat there, back straight, eyes unblinking, like a warrior born for the second time. In the thick darkness, Grace sat there, her back straight and her eyes unblinking, like a warrior who had been born a second time. The next morning, before the sun fully rose over the hills, Eli forced himself to stand, even though the wound in his shoulder still burned with pain. He retied the bandage, checked his gun, the saddle, and their supplies. Grace stayed quiet. Dark circles framed her eyes from blood loss and lack of sleep, but her gaze was steady. "We have to reach Fort Riley before Clay's men get there first," Eli said, his voice rough. "You think they'll believe us?" Grace asked, her hand tight on the reins. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly. "But if there's any place left that still believes in evidence, that's the last one." By noon, they followed the river to the low forest south of the fort. The first sign of the army appeared as a watchpost built from stone and wood, the American flag hanging quietly in the wind. A young guard aimed his rifle down and called out, "Halt! Identify yourselves!" Eli raised his hand. "My name is Eli Morgan. Former soldier. Service number 452. Served in Louisiana. I need to see the commanding officer." The guard glanced down, then shouted inside. Minutes later, the heavy wooden gate opened. A middle-aged officer in a neat uniform stepped out, Lieutenant Charles Renshaw, commander of Fort Riley. Eli got off his horse, stumbling from pain. Grace held him steady. Her presence, tall, torn clothes, blood seeping through bandages, made the nearby guards frown. "I have evidence of murder and corruption by Sheriff Clay Hargrove of Cold Ridge," Eli said right away. "This woman was hung in the desert like an animal because she tried to find her father's body." Renshaw frowned. "Where is the evidence?" Grace reached into her inner coat and pulled out an old necklace, stained with dried blood. "My father's," she said, holding her voice tight. "It still had blood on it when I found him." Renshaw signaled to a soldier. The man took the item, examined it, then nodded. "We will send a patrol to Cold Ridge tonight. He raised his hand again. "You two will remain in the fort under supervision until this is confirmed. You do not leave the gate." Eli nodded. Grace said nothing. She simply stood straight, even though her whole body seemed to fight gravity itself. That night, a cavalry unit of 6 riders left Fort Riley, heading toward Cold Ridge at full speed. But Clay did not wait that long. Before dawn, less than 8 hours after Eli and Grace entered the fort, the main gate shook with the sound of pounding hooves. From the watchpost, a guard shouted, "Riders approaching." Through the red dust, Clay Hargrove rode at the front, 5 thick-built men behind him, pistols clearly visible at their sides. They stopped at the gate, their eyes full of threat. "I am Sheriff Clay Hargrove of Cold Ridge," he shouted. "I'm here to take back a wanted criminal. Sir, hand her over." Renshaw stepped up onto the wall. "She is under investigation." "This is federal land. You have no authority here." Clay laughed loudly, his voice thick like old machine oil. "This isn't federal. This is civilian. She killed people, caused disorder, resisted the law. And that old soldier with her isn't much better." The guards began readying their rifles. The air grew tight like a drawn bowstring. Inside the barracks, Eli watched through a window, his face hard as stone. Grace stood behind him, fists clenched. He won't stop." "No," Eli said. "Because if he lets us speak, he loses everything." Lieutenant Renshaw called for more guards and gave a clear order. "If he crosses the boundary, treat him as an armed threat." When Clay heard this, his face turned red, but he did not attack. He knew that if he touched Fort Riley ground, real law would fall on him. "We're not finished. Morgan," he growled. "You can't hide behind stone walls forever." Then he turned his horse and pulled his men back. Grace watched him leave, her eyes not afraid, only filled with resolve. "He'll come back," she said. Eli nodded. "And next time that he brings more guns, we bring clearer truth." The morning light spread across the fort. One long night had ended, but the real storm, Eli knew, was still waiting just ahead. The morning light spread across the fort. One long night had ended, but the real storm, Eli knew, was still waiting ahead. By the middle of the next afternoon, the Fort Riley patrol returned. 6 riders came back with serious faces, bringing 2 witnesses with them, a young stable boy and an old wagon repairman from Cold Ridge. But the most important thing they carried was tied carefully to the lead horse, a thick cloth bundle, wrapped tight. As soon as they dismounted, the patrol leader, Sergeant Webb, walked straight into the command room and placed his report on Lieutenant Renshaw's desk. "We found the girl's father, Isaac Whitetail, behind the horse stable near the burned house. Cause of death, a gunshot wound to the back. Saw. The body was buried shallow. No coffin. No marker. Renshaw clenched his fist. Any sign of a struggle? Not clear. But there's more. Sergeant Webb set down a small cloth pouch filled with gold coins, each marked with the seal of the Cold Ridge Town Treasury. The stable boy confirms he saw Sheriff Clay Hargrove leaving Whitetail's house the night he disappeared. Webb continued. The old blacksmith confirmed the necklace belongs to Isaac. He carved it himself in his forge. Renshaw nodded and looked out the window, where Grace stood under the porch, still as stone. Without waiting, he gave the order. Call all guards. Issue an arrest order for Clay Hargrove. If he resists, use necessary force. The fort moved at once. A side gate opened, and 8 riders left Fort Riley at full speed toward Cold Ridge, where Clay might be gathering men, or worse, preparing to strike back. They did not have to go far. Less than an hour later, hoofbeats came from the north. Clay and 2 of his men had returned, this time quiet, trying to slip in through a narrow trail along the fort's edge. The guards were ready. Halt! Drop your weapons! Rifles were cocked all at once. Clay spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hate. You're protecting a murderer, he said. A woman who killed men. Killed my men. And Morgan is a deserter. Lieutenant Renshaw stepped forward onto the wall. Sheriff Clay Hargrove, you are under arrest for murder, interfering with a federal investigation, and unlawful use of force. Lies, Clay hissed and reached for his gun. 3 rifles aimed at his chest. A warning shot hit the dirt, and his horse reared back in panic. Clay was knocked to the ground and restrained in seconds. He screamed and struggled, his face red with rage. You think you can take me down? I am the law in Cold Ridge. Renshaw said nothing. He ordered Clay and his men tied, disarmed, and locked in an isolated holding room inside the fort. Grace watched from the porch. As Clay was dragged past, his eyes met hers. The pride was gone. Only hate and helpless fury remained. I'll drag you to hell with me, he snarled. Grace stayed silent. Eli stepped forward and stood between them. She survived hell, Eli said calmly. You're just starting to fall into it. Clay was pulled away, his shouting fading behind the stone walls. That afternoon, the army finished building the case. Statements were taken from Grace, Eli, and the witnesses. The gold coins were logged. Her father's necklace was kept as evidence. Eli sat in the command room, his shoulder freshly bandaged, reading the investigation orders with heavy eyes. Lieutenant Renshaw came in and placed a hand on his shoulder. You saved her life, and you brought us closer to something rare out here. Justice. Eli said nothing. He only looked toward the yard, where Grace sat quietly, holding the worn leather cord of her father's necklace, the last thing he had left her. The biggest fight was over, but Eli knew that for someone like Grace, the battle never truly ended. She had proven the truth, but the cost was wounds that would not heal easily. Not on her body, not in her memory, not in the watchful look she carried when facing the world. The sun set without celebration. No cheers, no gunfire. Just an ordinary evening on the plains of the Midwest. But for 2 people, it was the day they took back a piece of the dignity that had been stolen from them. It was just an ordinary afternoon on the plains of the American Midwest. But for 2 people, it was the day they took back a part of the dignity that had been stolen from them. The next day, soft early winter sunlight covered each stone of Fort Riley. In the yard, the flag was raised in silence. There was no marching music, no shouted commands, but everyone there understood that a dark chapter had closed, making room for something closer to justice, even if it came late and fragile. Sheriff Clay Hargrove and his 2 men were led away in handcuffs, placed onto a prisoner wagon headed for Topeka, where they would face a military court. Clay did not shout anymore. He kept his head down. His eyes no longer belonged to a man in power. but to someone who had lost everything: power, honor, and the mask of righteousness he had worn for years. Eli and Grace stood by the fort gate, watching as the wheels began to roll, lifting fine dust from the road. Neither spoke. But when the wagon disappeared behind the distant pine trees, Grace turned to Eli. "That's it," she said, her voice unsure, half relief, half emptiness. Eli nodded. "For him, Hus, yes. For you, not yet." And he was right. Soon after, Lieutenant Renshaw returned the cloth bundle holding her father's remains, Isaac Whitetail. The army had wrapped them carefully, covered in white cloth, and placed them in a small wooden box. There was no grand ceremony, only quiet respect. "You can take him back to where he belongs," Renshaw said. "We can send an escort if you want." Grace shook her head. "I'll do it myself." Eli stepped forward and gently squeezed her shoulder. "I'll go with you." They left Fort Riley early in the morning. This time, they carried fewer weapons and more memories, along with a grave that had not yet been laid to rest. They spoke little on the road. The sound of hooves, wind moving through grass, and the creak of the wagon wheels carrying the box became their only conversation. When they reached the small patch of land where her father had first built his shelter, near the forest edge, far from Cold Ridge, where the afternoon light was fading, beneath a birch tree, they dug a deep grave. Grace did not cry. With scarred hands, she lowered the box into the earth and bowed her head, whispering a prayer in her native Apache language. No one else understood the words, but each sound carried like a sad song rising from the land itself. Eli stood still, his hand on his hat, staring at the grave as if he were witnessing the quiet redemption of an entire generation. They filled the hole and placed stones in a circle around it. There was no headstone, no name carved in stone. Only a leather cord holding the small necklace hung from a branch above the grave, so anyone passing by would know that someone had lived here and had been loved. "He deserved more than this," Grace said softly. Eli replied in a low voice, "But at least he's no longer hidden in the ground like a criminal." That night, they slept beside the grave. The wind moved through the forest, and the sky was full of stars. In the darkness, Grace looked up and let out a quiet breath. "I thought that if my father was buried properly, I would feel lighter. But no, the pain just moved to a different place." Eli lay beside her, a hand resting on his chest, eyes closed. "Because you brought him into the light. And when the light comes, what we lost does not return. But we can live without lowering our heads." The next morning, they set out again, not back to the fort, but to the old homestead where they had once hidden. The house was burned to the ground, but Eli returned and began rebuilding from nothing. New wooden posts, a temporary roof, and the same stones he once stacked around the fire. Grace stayed. She did not ask, and she did not explain. She simply did not leave. They started again with small things, building a stable, lighting a fire, cooking meals, gathering wood. Eli never asked how long she planned to stay. Grace never said when she would leave. There was no agreement between them, only a steady presence. One afternoon, as the sun turned the empty field golden, they sat together on the steps of the newly built porch. "If you hadn't stopped that day," Grace began. Eli gently interrupted. "Then I would have missed the only chance to save an innocent person, and to save myself." She looked at him for a long time. In her eyes, there was no anger left, no fear, only trust. Something she had not given anyone since the day her father was killed. And there, on land once soaked with blood and burned to ash, two people who thought they had lost everything found something even more valuable: peace, even if only for a while. As winter slowly covered the hills of Kansas, laying a thin gray mist over the wild plains, Eli Morgan's farm, once burned to the ground by hatred, became a place of quiet peace. There were no more chasing horses, no judging eyes, Only two people remained, one old, one young, one who once carried a gun for his country, one who was once hung for being called a monster, living together like two souls who survived a great storm of history. Eli did not seek redemption, but in his quiet daily actions, fixing wooden beams, planting crops with grace, caring for the horses, there was a kind of repair, not to correct his own mistakes, but to mend what the world had done wrong to this woman, to her father, and to people like them, those who never had a chance to tell their own story. Grace did not become a completely new person. The scars on her back and the nightmares in her sleep were still there, but the difference was that she no longer carried them alone. Someone was willing to listen, willing to stand beside her when storms came. And sometimes, that alone is enough for a person to begin again. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Eli said to her, "Justice is not a place. It is something we choose to do every day, whether anyone sees it or not." Grace did not answer, but the next morning, she built a small wooden sign near the land they worked. It read, "Whitetail and Morgan, small farm, but honest." It was more than a name. It was a statement that they were no longer people on the run, or people living on pity. They were survivors, storytellers, witnesses to a truth that was once buried, and time moved on. No one from town dared to bother them anymore. Fort Riley sent word that Clay Hargrove had been convicted, stripped of his position, property, and reputation. The gold coins were returned to the Apache community. No one called Grace a monster again, because now they understood that true greatness does not live in the body, but in the courage to hold on to truth among wolves. There are people who wear no medals and never stand on high platforms, yet through small actions and the choice to stand on the side of what is right, they change the world around them. Eli Morgan was one of those people. And Grace Whitetail, the woman who once said, "Just kill me already," is proof that when truth has someone standing beside it, it never truly dies. My friend, if this story made you feel something, a tight feeling in your chest, a bit of hope, or simply faith in people, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because here, we do not just tell stories, we keep the truth alive. See you again in the next Western Tales.